I would request our distinguished panelists to please join us on stage, and Ambassador Shyam Saran, who will chair the session. He is the Chairman, Research and Information Systems for Developing Countries, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, Member of Parliament, Lok Sabha, Mr. Ashok Malik, Senior Fellow at the ORF and columnist, and author himself.
Leave room for Raja Mohan? Possibly. No, which ones?
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the launch of Raja Mohan's book on Modi's World. We have a very distinguished panel here this evening to discuss various aspects of this very path-breaking book that Raja Mohan has produced. He is, of course, very well known as one of India's best analysts. Of course, I think it was mentioned by Mr. Anand Goenka that finally we have a foreign policy for India, and we must thank Raja Mohan for providing us with a foreign policy. If Raja Mohan had not been a very distinguished journalist, I suspect that he would have been a distinguished diplomat, and that's a very big compliment coming from somebody from the tribe. When I read this book, I certainly was very conscious of the fact that Raja Mohan was analyzing something which is still a work in progress. And you know, it is sometimes very difficult to come to recent conclusions about something which is a work in progress. But I think he has done an excellent job in locating some of the key trends in India's foreign policy since Prime Minister Modi has taken office. I was particularly impressed by the fact that he identified some of the major departures that have been made in India's foreign policy, the various initiatives that the Prime Minister has taken, somewhat unusual kind of initiatives that he has taken, some initiatives which were not expected of him. For example, the new energy that he put in India's relations with the US, when many people had thought that the legacy of this, the visa denial would perhaps color his attitude towards the United States. But here is someone who is extremely pragmatic, who understood the importance of this relationship for India, for India's future, and did not hesitate to really not only repair the relationship, but actually to take it to a different level altogether. Also, with regard to the neighborhood policy, again something somewhat unexpected, that he would be, right from the word go, he would identify India's neighborhood as the most important item on India's foreign policy agenda. So Raja Mohan has in a way described the manner in which and the logic behind some of these moves that have been taking place. And I certainly came away with the sense that on the one hand, these are important initiatives, these are important departures, but at the same time, underlying them, there is a certain kind of continuity which is there in terms of India's foreign policy. And that should come as no surprise, because the parameters within which nations operate, the manner in which they perceive their national interests, these do not really change very much over time. They change somewhat incrementally. And I think if you look through the book, even though Raja Mohan may be perhaps emphasizing the departure aspect more, I, in fact, saw also the continuity aspect as being very important in terms of what he has set out to describe in this book. So this is a very important contribution to what I mentioned as a work in progress. But we have now several foreign policy initiatives which have been taken, which give us food for thought, also raw material for good analysis, and we have two very distinguished panelists here who will, I'm sure, will do that with great finesse. So I have great pleasure in now turning the floor to Mr. Shashi Tharoor, Member of Parliament, former Minister of State for External Affairs, and a great sort of commentator on India's foreign as well as domestic policy. Shashi, you have the floor.
Thanks, Amir. Well, Sham, I wasn't entirely sure whether we'd be having an exchange based on specific points or more, but if I can make a general observation, I think I want to assure you, young Anand Goenka, that as Mark Twain said about obituaries, the reports of India not having had a foreign policy are somewhat exaggerated. I think that in many ways, Sham is absolutely correct in that much of what Mr. Modi can legitimately be patted on the back for represents continuity in Indian foreign policy rather than a departure. And what is particularly striking, it's continuity despite the positions taken by the BJP when they were in opposition. That, as I pointed out in my book, India Shastra, a few months ago, on pretty much every major foreign policy initiative, Mr. Modi should be applauded for having abandoned the BJP position. So the same BJP that brought a no-confidence motion against the government of India on the Indo-US nuclear deal has not only endorsed it, but signed an additional protocol to put it into motion. The same BJP that refused to consider even a discussion of the Bangladesh land boundary agreement has now piloted it through the parliament and had it ratified, and is hailing it as a major breakthrough in the country. And so on and so forth. One can go from one foreign policy issue to another and see not just continuity of foreign policy, but a reversal of BJP policy, which to my mind is a good indication that foreign policy looks very different when you're sitting in South Block than when you're sitting in Gandhinagar. And that, I think, is the first point that I would slightly twit my friend Raja Mohan for. He's written an excellent book, very clear, very lucid, very well laid out, but far too generous, it seems to me, in praising the government for a whole lot of things which have been done by predecessor governments equally well and with a great deal more consistency. Having said that, if Raja Mohan has overlooked the fact that the BJP has turned around from its policies as a party into its policies as a government, the other thing that I would slightly fault him for is a sort of premature generosity in hailing no less than the dawn of a third republic in the present government. I have no difficulty with his analysis of sort of a first republic in India's history up to 1989. Some may say 91, but I mean, that's a minor quibble in that area. And then a sort of second republic since then. And Raja suggests here that there is perhaps some sort of dramatic departure that has taken place. I'm not sure I see that, and I'm sure that he will give an able account of his own conviction in defending that thesis. And I suppose my third and final general observation, that we can talk specifics later, would be that, that in acknowledging a couple of the positives, and I do acknowledge them, there's no question about the personal energy that Mr. Modi has brought to bear on diplomacy. I think everyone expected him to be much more focused on domestic policy. He has now been to 24 countries at last count, and that may even be an undercount. I've kind of lost track. He's all over the place, and he's doing so well. He says the right thing in whichever country he goes to and leaves a positive impression. I think that is something one should acknowledge. And the other thing we should acknowledge is that he has done something which I had actually in the past criticized Indian governments for not doing enough of, which is to attempt to leverage our soft power rather than merely take it for granted and let it happen. And so things like the International Day of Yoga as an attempt to to get India some sort of international benefits out of one of its attributes, one of its cultural attributes, should be praised, though I think he slightly blotted his copybook by the rather tacky effort to get into the Guinness Book of World Records, which was really not worthy of a government or a prime minister. That's the sort of thing one should leave to slightly wacky individuals who want to see their name in print, not something that I think a prime minister should have lent himself to. But that tackiness apart, the idea that our soft power is a tool that we can actually use to attract recognition and so on is very much worth acknowledging. But to balance those positives and to slightly undermine the narrative of continuity, there has been one disturbing development, and that is the onset of some, frankly, appalling incoherence on a couple of policy areas that matter a lot to India. The first is Pakistan, where we've seen the most amazing sort of yo-yo-like ups and downs. You start off with Pakistan being called, the Pakistani Prime Minister being called to the swearing in, then the advent of sari, shawl diplomacy and tender notes to each other's mothers, then suddenly dramatic firing across the line of control and the international border, heavy artillery, disproportionate retaliation, all of which nearly gets out of control. Then once again a decision the foreign secretaries should talk to each other. Then a decision to scrap the foreign secretary talks because of the Pakistanis doing what they've always done, which is to meet with the Hurriyat. Then again this dramatic thing with young Jaishankar being packed off on a Sark Yatra to go and see Islamabad under cover of a multilateral arrangement. Then the situation where the Prime Minister sits in Kathmandu ostentatiously reading a brochure while the Pakistani leader walks past him so he doesn't have to say hello to him. I mean, all of these, and now the most latest, the unexpected springing on the nation of the UFA talks, followed by somewhat discordant statements from Pakistan, followed by declarations by our foreign secretary that we'll give them as good as we get, or not worse, etc. I mean, there is, as a result, a perception that the government doesn't really know what it wants to do with Pakistan. And considering that they had a very clear idea when they were in opposition of what our government should not be doing, I think this incoherence needs to be pointed out for what it is. There's also been a similar confusion with regard to Israel and Palestine. One doesn't need to belabor it. We already saw a sort of desperate attempt at even-handedness during the Gaza assault, when the foreign minister even said that both are our friends, as if one could truly afford to equate a country that had actually killed 700 civilians and 170 children and destroyed a lot of property with the people who are suffering this, and at the same time had killed precisely two Israeli civilians in the course of this operation. But nonetheless, that equating apart, then an attempt was made to avoid a debate in Parliament, then an attempt was made to not have a resolution of the UN Human Rights Commission, followed by a resolution, by a vote by India in favor of the condemnation of Israel, which left everyone thoroughly confused as to what the government really stood for. And now most recently, this abstention on a resolution a few months later. So incoherence in these two areas causes some legitimate confusion in the minds of observers. And I think that's dangerous. I think a government, particularly one noted for such decisive leadership as it likes to portray itself as doing, should also show some more sure-footedness in foreign policy than it's done.
Thank you very much, Shashi, for those comments. I think what you said about the reversal of BJP policies, I would say that reversal of BJP in opposition, but resumption of BJP in government.
Fair enough.
Perhaps that would be perhaps a more accurate description of what is happening. But you're quite right that as far as certain key issues are concerned, certainly Mr. Modi has not hesitated to overturn some of the positions that his party took while the Congress was in office. Pakistan. Well, Pakistan represents one of those continuities, does it not? We have had in the past, dialogue, disruption, dialogue with the BJP in office, with the Congress in office, and what we see is perhaps the continuation of that with this government too. Which government has found the right strategy to deal with the Pakistan challenge? It's still, that is one foreign policy which still remains to be written. I'm not so sure that Raja Mohan has been able to crack that puzzle as well in his book. But I think very important points that you have made. That there are, as I said in my opening remarks, this is a work in progress. And I certainly hope that the kind of energy, pragmatism, which has been brought to bear on some of the other issues, as this government this Prime Minister start learning a little more about how to deal with some of these complex challenges, maybe we'll see some further progress. But we have a rather limited amount of time. So let me turn to Ashok. 10 minutes, perhaps, if you can please give us your perspective on what Raja Mohan has been saying.
Thank you very much, Mr. Saran. Thank you, everyone. And Shashi Tharoor is always a very difficult act to follow, but I shall try. He talks about continuity between governments and foreign policies. He's completely right there. There are vast elements of continuity. There is also continuity between oppositions. And I'll tell you what I mean. The other day I was watching a very interesting television debate following the UFA talks. And there was the BJP spokesperson trying very hard to make a reasonable point about how outreach with Pakistan was very necessary. And there was the Congress spokesperson, a colleague of Mr. Tharoor's, who was screaming and extremely worried about how Pakistan was beyond the pale, and actually saying that the Prime Minister's proposed visit to Pakistan was a security threat to him, and the Congress was very worried about him. So you can imagine what the situation was with a similar debate a year or 2 years ago. So there are elements to continuity.
You wouldn't have worried so much about our Prime Minister.
No, we would have. The BJP would have. Okay. Coming to Raja's excellent and lucid book, I have 5 points to make about not so much the achievements of Mr. Modi's foreign policy or the elements of continuity or breakthroughs, but the 5 salient features of his foreign policy that have struck me. Raja locates the history of Indian foreign policy in terms of shifts in domestic politics. 47 to 89 is what he calls the First Republic, 89 to 2014 is what he labels the Second Republic, and then 2014 onwards he tentatively calls the Third Republic. Now, if you look at the second half of the so-called Second Republic, the period between, say, 2000 and 2012, or perhaps between Pokhran and the nuclear deal, or between Y2K and Lehman Brothers, that was really the period when India's importance in the world grew at a very rapid pace, faster than our foreign policy architecture, than our political leadership, than our diplomats, than perhaps even the MEA realized. And in some senses, we weren't really prepared. We became more important. Our economy became much more important than the rest of our government system. What strikes me as interesting is that in the past year, the foreign policy curve has actually been ahead of the economic curve, which is always a good thing, provided the economic curve catches up sooner or later. But in a sense, the foreign policy architecture, the diplomacy is ready for the next surge in the Indian economy and what that will mean for India's position in the world. So in that sense, we will probably be better prepared. And that is the first thing that struck me, that rather than not focus on foreign policy at all and focus on just the domestic economy, Mr. Modi has made an effort to have the building blocks for an important foreign policy intervention in the world in place, and not wait till the economy actually catches up. Second, while other governments, previous governments, including the UPA government, have made this link, I think the link between foreign policy and domestic economic transformation has been made more strongly by this government than almost any previous government. Foreign policy as both an instrument of domestic economic transformation as well as a goal of domestic economic transformation. This is particularly evident if you read the joint statement with the United States when President Obama came here, or when Prime Minister Modi went to Washington in September last year. A word used in that period was embedding the US in the Indian developmental process. Other governments have also sought to do this, but never quite used the word. And that joint statement was just so detailed and sought to make the US and foreign policy generally a factor in developing various aspects of Indian social life and economic life. And there was a continuity there, and it was not just limited to the US, because if you read the joint statement with the Chinese after the visit to China. You can see a similar thought process going into that joint statement as well. Of course, it's not as detailed and not as deep as the joint statement with the Americans, but you can see what's being offered to the Chinese provided the politics plays out well. Third, coming to China in particular, I think the government has followed a slightly different policy than the UPA government on China. In the UPA years, I felt we sometimes ceded ground to the Chinese politically, but sought to build this barrier, this fortress India, and keep them out of economic activity in our country, deny them market access in India, to our detriment. Because frankly, China has a role to play in India's economic transformation, as do many other countries. This government seems to have reversed it. Its market access to Chinese companies, including technology companies, so-called sensitive companies, is much greater today than it was 2 years ago. It's a work in progress, of course, and I hope it becomes even better. But the Chinese are being challenged politically. They're being challenged in South Asia, they're being challenged in the Indo-Pacific, they're being challenged in Mongolia. It's an unequal challenge at the moment because Chinese capacities are way bigger than India's, but at least it's happening. And I think that is a departure from the previous government. Fourth, the immediate neighborhood, not including Pakistan. I feel an attempt has been made to prize or sort of claw back space that had been lost in the past few years, space that had been lost to the Chinese, space that had been lost to just neglect. We've seen this with the BBI initiative, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, and Nepal, which is, I would say, a legacy of Mr. Modi's. It's not something which had happened before, especially the cooperation in energy and connectivity and so on. In Sri Lanka, this is an old joke in Delhi that the MEA doesn't understand how elections work. Don't tell a Sri Lankan that. In broadly speaking, the idea of converting or reconverting the South Asia into the Indian subcontinent, and the two are conceptually very different, I think started with Prime Minister Modi inviting the leaders of the other SAARC countries to his swearing in. Finally, perhaps I'm being premature here, and perhaps this is too early in the game, but I think an attempt has been made to get India involved in the politics of the Muslim world as a force for the good. The Muslim world is seeing a lot of internal debate and turmoil between those who are beyond the pale and those who we should actually be supporting. Mr. Modi and his government have entered this contest, as it were, which in Bangladesh, which again the Manmohan Singh government had also entered, to be fair. He's also entered this context to some degree in Central Asia, which is how I interpret his recent visit to Central Asia. And in the coming year, I suspect he will enter this contest in the Middle East and the Arab world, without sacrificing the relationship with Israel, which I think this government has been very clear is perhaps the most important relationship for us in the Middle East, and Israel is perhaps the most trusted friend in the Middle East. Not something the UPA government was willing to admit or was happy admitting, but there I feel this government, despite the vote last year, which was perhaps not in keeping with the philosophy of this government's foreign policy, despite that vote last year, I think a course correction has happened. When it comes to disappointments, I'll just take 2 minutes. When it comes to disappointments, I agree completely with Shashi that the Pakistan policy has been a puzzle. It's been unpredictable to the point of being sometimes inconsistent. And more than being located in a conceptual framework, I think it's been episodic. It's responded to episodes. And this has disappointed me because at some point it needs to be consistent. I think it was Emerson who said that consistency is the virtue of an ass. Sometimes I think an ass would make a very good diplomat. Finally, I had one last point, just one sec, lost it. Yes, the final point is about defense diplomacy. The defense ministry as an alternative or complementary source of foreign policy ideas, of ideas for what India should be doing in the world from, of course, its strategic perspective. As a friend of mine who is in the audience put it the other day, Indians traditionally see the defense ministry as the defense procurement ministry, and not as a source of foreign policy ideas, which is a big problem in our system, because I do remember in '98 when George Fernandez, as defense minister, made that speech about China being a strategic threat, or I can't remember the word he used. Some of the criticism that was mounted against him was that he was treading on the toes of the MEA. Now, as defense minister, it's his job to state what he thinks is a threat to India's long-term defense. And it's for the MEA to live with that and to find a way of reconciling his point of view with its. But the Ministry of Defense hasn't quite challenged the MEA in the past year. It hadn't in previous years as well, but I expected a change. And perhaps that pleases Mr. Jaishankar, because he's not being intellectually challenged by the Ministry of Defense, but sometimes I wish he were a little less comfortable and threatened that much more by ideas from the Ministry of Defense.
Okay, I think we'll have to
now
shorten the next round of comments, but thank you very much for your 5 points. The MEA, I think it would be fair to say, has to live with a lot of defense ministry like postures which come out in the public, and it's very easy to say that you should lump it, but I think if you are running the foreign policy of a country, you cannot have foreign policies for each ministry. I would hope. With respect to what you mentioned about the accent given to economic diplomacy, I think that's a fair comment. Before I give the floor to Shashi to make very, very brief points, because we also have Raja to speak for a few minutes, just to say that one of the things which I worry about is really capacity. That we have, of course, made a lot of commitments, but we really do not yet have an infrastructure to ensure quick delivery. And this is where I think while we have done very well in terms of formulating what are very sensible policies, but I think we need to really put the accent now on the nuts and bolts of how to get foreign policy actually implemented. So that's something which I think you have also referred to, the possibility that many of the things that have been announced may not really deliver what they are supposed to deliver because of the lack of capacity. But I hope that is something which Jaishankar will also perhaps deal with. But Shashi, just 1 minute to please respond to him.
Just very quickly, because I don't disagree with much of what Ashok has said, but on the economic diplomacy argument, I do want to stress that in as much as there was such a thing as a Manmohan doctrine, it was precisely this, that foreign policy should serve the interests of the domestic transformation of India. He said this in innumerable speeches. I've heard him do it to closed-door meetings of Indian ambassadors. It was articulated further by his Foreign Secretary, Shankar Menon. It was the thesis of my book, Pax Indica. This is not a new idea. And if Mr. Modi is doing it, it actually underscores the continuity argument, not a significant departure at all.
It was a new idea. So it's expressed more strongly than in...
It's expressed strongly, but it has been expressed strongly before. The problem is you guys in the media never thought that anything Mr. Manmohan Singh said was strongly expressed enough, and you don't give him the credit he rightly deserves. Secondly, Shyam, on your point on Pakistan, I mean, in all fairness, there was a difference. I think Mr. Manmohan Singh had a very clear and coherent vision, and the disruptions that occurred all occurred because of actions from Pakistan. Whereas here, some of the disruptions are occurring because of somewhat impulsive decisions made by our own government without any context or predictability, and that's the curious issue. But I'll leave it there in respect of your 1 minute.
Okay. Yeah. Raja, you have the floor.
Thanks. I think the discussion has already warmed up, and I'm not going to respond to all the issues that have been raised. But I thought I'll just make 4 sets of points, I think some of which will address the issues that have been raised. One, I think you've seen some repartee, I mean, between, what Shashi being a leader of the opposition, so he had to pro forma say some things, and I'm sure he said it, but Shashi is also a well-known scholar on foreign affairs, foreign policy. In fact, his book goes back to the early one, goes back to the 80s. what is worrying, I think, is really the partisanship that has come to the current debates on foreign policy. In a sense, last 10 years, I mean, I think once the NDA went into the opposition, there was this deep problem in terms of not willing to back some of the things they had done when Mr. Vajpayee was in charge. And I think that breakdown of that consensus, and I think was problematic because the BJP, which supported the nuclear initiative, opposed it. So I think you saw that happening on a number of issues. But I think the good news, of course, that was the bad news in a sense, there was at least a sense of a broad shared understanding between different groups, and that understanding broke down somewhat in the last 10 years. But the good news is this, I mean, for all the reporting that we've seen even in the last 1 year, an attempt at restoring some consensus. Take Bangladesh land boundary agreement. Mr. Manmohan Singh could not finish what he started.
Only because of opposition.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm coming to that. I'm supporting your point. That, in fact, the BJP created problems. In fact, Mr. Jaitley stood up in the parliament and said it's unconstitutional, the bill. But what we saw happen, I think, once the BJP came to power, Mr. Modi was willing to dissociate himself completely from the approaches that the previous NDA did in opposition and went wholeheartedly to back this. And then even more good news is that Shashi, as the key role in the parliament, as the chairman of the standing committee, actually facilitated the consensus so that it could go through the parliament quickly. So what you see is not what you're getting here. There is actually, I think, under the present system, there is, I think, an emerging common understanding, and I think which is good. Some political argument, I think, opposition has to oppose, so there will be some of that. But I think we are going down a reasonably good path. The second, I think, is the whole question of, I think the same thing you could say applied to Pakistan. The same thing applied to the range of other issues. So I think there is some measure of, emerging consensus between different groups. The second issue I wanted to talk about was the idea that, look, this is about work in progress. How do you judge a new government so quickly? But I think if you look at the record of the previous, at least the two governments, in fact, what they did in the first year was actually largely their legacy stood what they did in the first year. It's quite interesting that what Manmohan Singh did in the first year, I think you were the foreign secretary, sir, that the nuclear initiative with the Americans, an agreement on the boundary, on the parameters and the guiding principles on the boundary settlement with the Chinese, and a broad understanding on how to resolve the Kashmir dispute. All the three were done within the first year of Mr. Manmohan Singh's government. Of course, the story for the rest of the 9 years was, of course, struggling to deal with the backlash, both within the party and beyond. I mean, that's my judgment. But the fact is, the rest of the period was really, you were trying to cope with what was started in the first few months. Dramatic, significant, but I think there you had the problem. Go back to Vajpayee's tenure as a prime minister. Nuclear tests, March 98, he was sworn in. May 98, nuclear tests. September 98, he's talking about India and US as natural allies. February 99, he's in Lahore trying to cut a deal. So in some senses, actually, what he did in the first year was still a struggle to carry through the ideas that you pushed across in the very first year. So in some senses, you have to make a judgment. I mean, I think you can, get a broad sense, because you're not going to get the full sense of what this government is going to do in the next 4 years. But I think in terms of what it has done so far is a reasonable basis for assessing where it might actually go. That brings me to the third set of issues on the question of continuity and change. I think both Ambassador Shamsaran and Shashi both have talked about that I'd emphasized too much on change and too little on continuity. But actually, if you read the second sentence of the book, which is the introduction, it says, look, governments, foreign policies don't change with the change of governments. So in some senses, there is actually that there is continuity, and in fact, thanks to the permanent establishment, you have a leading figure of the permanent establishment, Shamsaran, former foreign secretary, and chairman of the National Security Advisory Board. You have Jaishankar, who is the current foreign secretary, and you have all these young, not so young, the senior foreign service officials here, who served all the governments of the last 3 times. And I think the presence of, unlike in America where we have a permanent bureaucratic establishment, maintains a level of continuity which I think, which doesn't exist in other places. So I think there is a measure of continuity, and we've seen that in the case of the US. The original idea came from the NDA government. So as you said, the big idea in terms of converting it into a deal came under the UPA government, and it's actually the NDA government now trying to wrap it up because of the slowdown that has taken place. So in that sense, I think 2 BJP PMs we've had, 2 Congress PMs we've had, and 3 non-Congress, non-BJP prime ministers since the reform era. But if you take the period as a whole, I mean, of last 25 years in the Second Republic, there is a measure of broad directional continuity. But each of the prime ministers has also brought his own emphasis. And I think that's where the trick is. I mean, I think when Mr. Gujral first said, no, Gujral doctrine, or be nice to your neighbors, I mean, a lot of my friends said, look, he's appeasing. Here is a classic appeaser. But we've seen that you continued it. I mean, everyone continued the same policy, and today it has acquired a new vigor under the Prime Minister Modi. So therefore, I think there is then the judgment. Then the problem is, when do you say what is, when do you say there is change, or how do you find that balance between what is continuous and what is changing? There I must disagree with Anand that foreign policy, of course, existed even before independence. I mean, I get criticized for saying that. A foreign policy begins when you have a territorial entity. The moment you draw, this is my sovereign space, then there is something which is not under your sovereign space, and how you deal with that non-sovereign spaces around you, that is foreign policy. And it starts mostly in the neighborhood. A lot of our foreign policy today still goes back to the British period. The things that we say about exclusive sphere of influence, of primacy in the region, many of these were constructed under the Raj itself. And I think a lot of that continues. But I think the judgment is, what has this government changed? I think everyone agrees on the energy and intensity part of it. There are, in terms of execution, that certainly it has done more. But I think the question, I think, what I've argued in the book is, there are limitations, there are going to be problems. That some of the problems are really going to deal with the political dynamic at home, that there are deep divisions today, that some of the agenda that the government has outlined to carry it through, you will have problems, for example, on the economic reforms, which is the key. I mean, without the economic transformation, your foreign policy is not going to succeed. So therefore, how far and how fast? The question of domestic unity. Can you maintain your internal unity in order to achieve all the goals, on a range of goals that we have set for ourselves? And finally, the coordination part, I think, which Ashok referred to. In fact, the problem with the Ministry of Defense is still 50 years behind, or what the MEA is saying, that, look, defense diplomacy is part of the defense, your foreign policy toolkit. Your MOD is still not on board. Your problem with the Ministry of Commerce, what they think of the trade negotiations, what the country ought to do, there are constant problems. The range of, I think, how does the Foreign Office, which is a non-executive agency in domestic, how does it build that consensus? And I think that has to come from the Prime Minister himself. That has to come from political leadership. There, I think the hopeful side is, you have a strong government, you have a strong leader. Hopefully that there is enough capacity today to drive the system and to rebuild some kind of a national consensus, so that the claim with Third Republic, in fact, there is a question mark in the book whether this will be a Third Republic, but my sense is that I think the conditions, both internal and external, provide an opportunity, I think, for the Prime Minister to make that structural change in the way India deals with the world, and to emerge as a leading power in the international system.
Well, thank you very much, Raja. I think you have very succinctly summarized what your main conclusions are. You mentioned that each of the governments set a direction during their very first year in office. At least that has been true for the last few governments. But I hope that the running out of steam, which we saw in the earlier instances, does not happen again. So we wish that this is an inflection point, as you said, and there is a big change that we see. Secondly, I would just like to, in defense of Indian foreign policy establishment. The point that I was trying to make, and also which I referred to in my review of your very good book, is that your sense that there is somehow a strategic culture of negotiating against India's interests. That is something which I find difficult to accept, because I think if you once we have been talking about the continuity, I think if you look at the performance of the Indian foreign policy establishment, I would say over the last 50 to 60 years, it has been remarkably successful in actually adjusting to the very, very radical changes that have taken place in the global environment. I think we get less credit for it than is due. But on that note, let me thank all the panelists for their very, very perceptive comments. And now we have the floor conceded to Mr. Jaishankar. Yeah.
Launch of the book.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted on behalf of ORF to welcome you to the launch of this book by a colleague of ours, Dr. Raja Mohan. Raj in many ways embodies ORF's spirit or approach to research, which is interdisciplinary, deep knowledge of India, and our understanding that we bring to bear on policy and hopefully change it in a better direction. There's been an interesting discussion on Raj's book, and many, many points have been raised. But before that, I just want to mention a few points about the Observer Research Foundation for many of you who may not be aware of it. One is that ORF was formed in 1991. It was brought together to merge many different opinions about the economic package which was required to be passed at that time. Dr. Mantek Singh would know well those times. And we successfully did bring onto an ORF platform economists, intellectuals, politicians of different persuasions, and did manage to get them to agree to some kind of common understanding. But from those modest beginnings, today ORF has grown into probably one of the most preeminent and well-known Indian think tanks, which pursues research in a, I would believe, completely non-partisan way. And to me, that is reflected in the fact that you could on any given day have 2 op-ed pieces by people from ORF arguing completely opposite points of view. Sounds like the Modi government says Shashi Tharoor, but I may not fully agree with that. However, what I would like to say is that Raja's book reflects, in that sense, exactly what ORF stands for. We would like discussion, we would like debate, we would like policy to be taken after a prolonged understanding or attempt to understand the issues involved, just as there was this discussion here. And I think now, without further ado, because I'm delighted I can cut short this speech because the Foreign Secretary is pressed for time, and I would like to invite him to come and shed some light on many of the issues that were raised in this discussion. Dr. Jaishankar.
Well, I think, like all of you, I'm delighted to be here this evening at the release of Dr. Raja Mohan's new book, Modi's World. I have good reasons, both personal and professional, for doing so. Raj and I have known each other for more than 4 decades, and I'm possibly his oldest acquaintance in this room, Nirmala included, and my mother will vouch for that. We have studied together, we have debated together, we represent the JNU generation that first impacted on the city. Some of you may not know that we even initially wrote together. Our shared journey moved comfortably from our university days into our professional lives. Though our paths diverged, we inhabited connected worlds and for many years have been each other's sounding boards. Therefore, I do follow Raj's endeavors and achievements with special attention and, might I say, with a sense of pride. Raj is, of course, indisputably India's most recognized face in international relations. As in the case of our subject today, images usually have a basis in reality. Most of you are familiar with his many writings, but I'd like to refer specially to his 4 books. In 2003, Raj wrote Crossing the Rubicon. Its subtitle said it all. This was about making of India's new foreign policy. He followed that up with Impossible Allies, an analysis of what then was an improbable understanding between India and the United States, now of course taken as natural and inevitable. His next work, Samudra Manthan, addressed the then less than universally recognized phenomenon of Sino-Indian rivalry in the Indo-Pacific. In each of these cases, he picked issues that marked definitive turning points in recent Indian foreign policy. The nuclear tests of 1998, the India-US agreements, and the implications of the parallel, if differential, rise of China and India. Clearly, we are dealing with an analyst who has a track record of great discernment, one sensitive to the shifting sands of global politics, and with a gift to look beyond the horizon. That he has chosen to focus on Modi's India tells us as much about the subject as it does about the author. This then brings us to the issue of the foreign policy underway today. How much of it is continuity? How much of it is change? What do the changes signify? How much is substance? How much is optics? Some opinions have been offered already, not all of them without bias. I'm sure that if we subject the diplomacy of the last year to a smell test, we can arrive at a reasonably clear conclusion. Think of the Madison Square Garden event and the presence of 30+ members of the US Congress. Recall the meeting of President Xi Jinping in Xi'an, not Beijing. Remember Barack Obama's visit on 26 January, or the bonding with Shinzo Abe in Kyoto. Assess the recent response of Nepal and Bangladesh on long-standing issues. Look at Operation Rahat in Yemen or Operation Maitri in Nepal. Consider the integrated tours of Central Asia, East Asia, and the Indian Ocean. So let me ask you, does this look like diplomacy as usual? Let me mention examples that convey this sense of change. A neighborhood policy that puts a premium on connectivity, contacts, and cooperation. When required, one that is both reasonable and firm. A China policy that triangulates security interests, economic cooperation, and international politics. The nuclear initiative, a matter as close to my heart as Raja Mohan's, and one that we cut our teeth on 4 decades ago, has moved back into the active terrain. We have seen forward movement with the US, France, and Russia, and work in progress with Australia and Japan. The land boundary agreement with Bangladesh and the connectivity understandings have been game changers. Cooperation on power generation and post-earthquake assistance in Nepal have transformed that relationship. A coherent Indian Ocean strategy is under implementation. Visits to even nearby nations after decades and impending summits of the Pacific Islands and of African states represent a different mindset. Our flagship development programs are attracting favorable international response. The impression of India being somewhat easier for business has started to make an impact as well. And personal chemistry has emerged as a powerful tool in our diplomatic kit. Some of these are new developments. Others are a decisive conclusion of an unfinished national agenda. Either way, they signal different times. They speak of greater confidence, more initiative, certainly stronger determination, and obviously express the growth of our capabilities that have been built up over time. In many ways, they constitute both a larger footprint and a more intensive one. It is therefore time to ask ourselves whether India should raise the level of its ambitions. Are we content to react to events, or should we be shaping them more? On occasion, even driving them. Should we remain a balancing power or aspire to be a leading one? Diplomacy involves management of contradictions in international politics, and the pursuit sometimes of contradictory goals. In India's current position, it is possible to make a case that simultaneous pursuit of multiple relationships creates a virtuous cycle where each one drives the other higher. So, is it then time for greater activism? Tactics also offer some insights. Confidence leads to initiatives and drives strategy. In contrast, reactive diplomacy is by nature one of a lower profile. Nor does it encourage an integrated view of regions where local balances sometimes offer advantages to be exploited. On the other hand, more proactive diplomacy tends to look at a broader landscape. Even in its implementation, it overcomes the silos that are a particular bane of our working style. Recent months have seen some innovations. Let me focus on a few to bring out their larger implications. First, developing narratives is part of a transition towards a leading power. You would have noted the attention paid to India's sacrifices in the First World War a century ago. Fast forward to our extraordinary record in peacekeeping operations. Now look at the impressive disaster response efforts, including Nepal and Yemen, and see how the story of an India that has always done its utmost for the world strengthens our position as a responsible international stakeholder and our credentials for a permanent seat in the UN Security Council. 2, the creation of a new lexicon and imagery can often be helpful in assimilating and implementing changes. The term neighborhood first has a clear self-explanatory message. Even a shift from look east to act east is not without its meaning. The introduction of heritage and lifestyle into conversations on climate change is worth considering. The image of a first responder in humanitarian assistance and disaster relief situations has great value. Valuing democracy creates as many bonds as countering terrorism. Reflecting these terms appropriately and effectively in our dialogues is truly worthy of consideration. And the use of social media, you will agree, has given our diplomacy a definite edge. A related issue is the importance of soft power. The impact of the International Day of Yoga on the world has been tremendous. We just felt it in Central Asia and in our BRICS and SCO meetings. This is perceived as a universal expression of Indian culture. Nothing could be more effective in bringing out the relevance of our heritage and traditions. A less noticed example is of our connections with Buddhism, a message that has somehow got obscured after the 1950s. This too has great potential. A fourth aspect is that of persons of Indian origin. Their achievements have long been broadly appreciated, but till now, we have perhaps not fully utilized their role as bridges to different societies. Motivating them is key to their making a fuller contribution to the land of origin. And finally, do look at the direct linkage between our diplomatic activity and national development efforts, a subject which the panelists addressed as well. Today, many of our outcomes reflect the contributions that international partners can make in terms of resources, technology, and best practices to various flagship programs. This has actually led to the emergence of a very different agenda for our interactions. Taken together, these developments have made themselves felt in only 1 year. India's priorities are clearer with respect to its neighborhood, its broader region, and in making a global impact. Diplomacy now helps to play a role in our national development. There has been a concerted effort to make full use of personal chemistry, narratives, culture, and our diaspora. The world is beginning to believe that we mean business, whether in business or otherwise. And as we proceed, perhaps it is time to reassess our ability to drive and lead on global issues and be active and nimble rather than neutral or risk-averse. Tracking all these developments in foreign policy will be a robust business, if a complicated one. What I would like to say today is that especially in the last 2 decades, Raj has been both the predictor and the dissector of change. I wish more power to his pen, and like all of you, will continue to follow him avidly. Thank you.